So welcome everyone for our next, or I don't even know, fourth or fifth webinar now in the AHE webinar series. So my name is Ariane Agunsoye, and I will be the chair for this session today. And we welcome Lorena Lombardozzi and Ikpe. And Lorena is going to talk about the nexus between market transition, state capitalism, and structural transformation through the Belt and Road initiatives. Sorry, someone has, I think. Yes, I would like to ask everyone to mute their mic while the presentation is going on, and then we will later on switch actually into a question round where you can either use the chat or the microphone. So let me go back to the presenters and discussants today. So Lorena is a lecturer in economics at the School of Social Science and Global Studies at the Open University. And she's a co-director of Ikpe, so Innovation, Knowledge and Development Research Center. She's also affiliated researcher to Cambridge Center Asia Forum at the University of Cambridge. And before actually she started to work in academia, she also worked quite extensively as a development economics in Latin America, as an economist at the UNODC in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, and she worked at the European Commission and the Italian Ministry. So extensive experience with policy recommendations as well. And her current research relates to theoretical debates on political economy, growth and distribution, as well as areas of international development, including gender and feminist economics. So Lorena will give her talk, as I mentioned before, on the topic, the nexus between market transition, state capitalism, and structural transformation. The talk will be around 30 to 35 minutes. And then we are thrilled to have, as a discussant, Ikpe, who is a senior lecturer in development economics in Africa and the deputy director of the African Leadership Center at King's College. And her research offers a critical understanding of socioeconomic transformation processes and centers on global South context. And she's also been working and supporting the work of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the Economic Community for West African States, and the UK All Party Parliamentary Group. So we are thrilled to have both together today for the seminar which takes place today. So we will listen now to Lorena first, and then have a round of comments and feedback from Ikpe for around 15 to 20 minutes. And then afterwards, we will move on to the questions and discussion round. So I look forward to listening now to Lorena, and I will pick up then later
on. Thank you, Ariane, and thank you all the organizer of the seminar series of the Heterodox Economics Association. I followed up as much as I could, and it has been great. And thanks again for inviting me, because honestly, this paper has been sitting for a couple of years on my desk, and because of COVID and 3,000 others issues that happened these years, I haven't had the mental space to focus on it, although it's really important for my intellectual evolution, because it builds it builds on my PhD research, which now it started. I was counting today, almost 10 years ago. So this is kind of a theoretical and empirical update of a debate that I've started engaging with long time ago. So thank you for offering me this opportunity and give me the incentive to finalize the paper. As I said, I'll be talking 30 minutes. If I'm going like longer, just let me know. So this paper is a mix between what was my previous research on the market transition and my, I have to wait because, okay. And what has been at the moment a revive of the debate among both policymakers and academics on what we call state capitalism, which is a very loaded term Also very contested because it's been embedded in very different geographical and historical content. So I'm basically gonna problematize it even more today. And I'm gonna trying to bridge, I'm gonna make it this exercise to understand what is state capitalism, and in particular the role of the state in capitalist relations of production nowadays. And basically I'm gonna look at the state both as a shaper and regulator of market, but also as active participants in the economy. And I'm going to do that by looking at the potential bridge that the literature of state capitalism has with the very important literature of market transition that post-Soviet regions are basically looking at over the past centuries, let's say. And I'm trying to look at these two theoretical debates by looking at a more of the materialistic understanding of how economic growth is conceived by us, heterodox economists, which are patterns of structural transformation and the relation to the distribution of surplus, but also with the creation of the employment. So I don't have a magic bullet on that, but this is an important exercise. I'm really glad to share with you so that we can have a fruitful discussion, hopefully later. So this is basically the structure of my presentation. I'm going to look at the divergent patterns of market transitions. So we will know that there is a dual kind of understanding identified with the shock therapy versus more a gradualist approach. I'm going to link that to the historicization of patterns of state-led accumulation through the primitive socialist accumulation theories. And then I'm going to link that to what is capitalism, state capitalism now. I'm going to use my case study, so the case of Uzbekistan, from the independence period from 1991, understanding what has been the various regulatory changes over the past 25, 30 years now, and also look at what has changed as a result of the increasing pressure from international economic governance, if you want neoliberal economic governance, and these new important actors, which is Chinese capitalism or Belt and Road Initiative, if you want. And then basically, I'm trying to conclude by looking and highlighting a little bit what have been the contradictions of these patterns of hybrid capitalism. So to go back, so to go a step back regarding the debate of state capitalism nowadays, I wanted to make an epistemological point about the way in which market transition has been framed. And we all know that there is a narrative of the narrative of market transition and the pathway of growth to what are called transition economies, which I'm implicitly going looking at the post-Soviet states, but maybe later on with the discussion we will look at how there has been similar patterns in sub-Saharan Africa, or also in Latin America, for instance, so in the so-called global South. And basically, there has been a very hegemonic understanding of what is the discourse around market transition, which has been depicted around two ways of saying state-market relations, perceived as dichotomic. One is identified as what is called shock therapy or Big Bang, basically based on the Washington Consensus, which was pushing for fiscal discipline, public expenditure away from subsidies, financial liberalization of interest rates, trade liberalization, so abolition of removal of tariffs, removal of barriers to foreign direct investments, rapid processes of privatization and blind, so intersectoral, process of deregulation of prices, and clear property rights creation. The second approach to market transition is being identified as a more gradual and more stadalist approach. And there has been many friends and others within the heterodox community who have tried to problematize this very hegemonic approach that has been the shock theory and the Big Bang approach to market transition by, for instance, looking at the micro foundation of preferences choice about purchasing, such as Kornai, like the recent book by Bella Weber that has ontologically problematized the meaning of prices in the Chinese economy, not seeing as a signal to the market, but rather as a tool of redistribution in the macroeconomy. But also like the ownership and clearance of property right, not seen as a sufficient condition to create efficient relations of productions. However, there is a mantra that has been, I don't want to use the word imposed, but it's been clearly represented by the powerful, what are called multilaterals or multilateral financial institutions. And even like recently, I was trying to update the quotes, and I had no difficulty in finding recent reports that state, for instance, from OECD, so not even looking specifically at transition economies, so even advanced economies, but also in low-income countries with the IMF, that says, and I quote OECD report of last year, state ownership can be a source of distortions. The state might provide unfair advantages to state-owned enterprise relative to domestic or foreign competitors. State-owned enterprises that are insulated from competitive pressures may lack the incentives to improve efficiency and innovate. But we basically know, and there has been a lot of empirical work, for instance, by Mazzucato, that has proved how innovation is a result of state stimulus. So there is a contested and clear tension within these two understanding of what market transition is. And clearly the neoliberal pathway, and so the Washington Consensus, has won this battle over the past 10 years. There has been cases, exceptionalism, such as China, such as Uzbekistan, but has been considered exactly like heterodox and kind of anti-hegemonic or anti-systemic. What is very interesting as well is that the Washington Consensus has evolved, and it is very interesting, and Alami and Dixon has published a recent paper on Antipode today, this like last month, I think, where they have been very like good at grasping the evolution from the Washington Consensus to the Wall Street Consensus, because now, and I was reading the second part of this OECD report that says that was basically acknowledging the fact that state-owned enterprise has a legitimacy in economics, but they still have to comply with corporate governance models and a capital account liberalization. And Daniela Gabor has basically wrote many things about that. And the OECD says to minimize the potentially negative impact of state ownership on the economy and ensure efficient use of taxpayer money, the OECD has developed guidelines on corporate governance and state-owned enterprise, which spell out the condition that state-owned enterprise should meet to operate in a sound, competitive, and regulatory environment conducive to economic growth. So competition and sound environment towards like corporate or market-led relations of production have to be the conditions sine qua non for state-owned enterprise to survive in the capitalistic market economy. So it is very interesting how across decades now, private ownership has been treated as axiomatic and is the end point to successful economic growth. However, there has been this, counter-hegemonic argument that is still alive, and as we said, has been revived recently by both academics and policymakers that the transformation of society is not unidirectional and is not an horse race. And basically, there is a lot of empirical evidence that have shown across different regions that a combination of public planning and hybrid form of accumulation, so both private and public, has led often to higher higher level of socioeconomic growth, less volatility in regimes of private accumulation, and also has created, has avoided atomization of the market, which has led to social poverty and social unrest in some cases. What I'm trying to argue in this paper is that there has been an overlooking of some of the premises of the mainstream in the debate of market transition. One is that there has been an institutional, is about the specificity of the entity of the state as regards to its capacity of multidirectionism and multiscalarity. And this has been argued by the strategic relational approach of Jessup in 2008 that used in a recent paper published by Ikpe on state-led upgrading. But also there's been an overlook about the timing. And there has been work done, for instance, by Kaplan on the reason of patient capital for long-term infrastructure development, for instance, but also on the skepticism of rapid transfer of ownership in the case, for instance, of communist economies by, for instance, Kornai in the case of Hungary. And related to the timing, there is also an issue with regards to the pace. So the reasons and the implications, socioeconomic implication that a slow pace of accumulation, especially private accumulation, would entail for long-term and sustainable and inclusive development. So what we need to trying to emphasize is both having a focus on the dialectic strategies of accumulation, so broad, private, and public, and also understand how this outcome of surplus accumulation distribute and can contribute to nurture economic and socioeconomic development. And this will help us to also kind of complete the missing link with the current debate on this historization of varieties of state capitalism. So there are, as I said, there is a lot of literature now focusing on the return of the state, but there are still missing links in relation, for instance, to class and so to distribution and social stratification, but also to space and time. So historicizing this debate can be very helpful, and I believe that the market transition literature can help to contextualize and complete this very long exercise. What I'm arguing is that there is a limited attention to the identification of the source of surplus, and how this output surplus can be distributed beyond private profit. And this creates distinctive strategies of accumulation and distribution. So both the identification of the source of surplus, but also the maintenance and distribution of this surplus is the kind of explanatory variables that can help us explain strategies of accumulation and distribution over time. And because structural transformation through the diversification of the sectorial specificity, but also because of technological innovation and creation of employment, can actually help to classify and create a more coherent taxonomy of the strategies of accumulation and distribution beyond this dichotomy of neoliberal capitalistic growth versus state capitalism. And here I basically use this very interesting and too often forgotten notion of primitive socialist accumulation to kind of prove that there has been an historical continuum of between primitive socialist form of accumulation and current forms of state capitalism. And I quote like some of the very important also for the debate on decolonization, a quote that has been published also by Day in 1975. And I mean, these are debates that also goes back to the 70s. I look at the source of accumulation in non-capitalistic setting. And this is a very interesting quote that says, if the main resource of capitalist private accumulation is the colonies, the only outside resource of Soviet state is the non-socialist village. So the primitive social accumulation, basically the accumulation in the hands of the state of material resources coming from outside the state complex, has been identified as the origin of capital accumulation in contexts where, like Western countries, for instance, where the surplus was created by exploiting imperialist relations. So there's been a different way of doing that, but the main patterns, the main trend is that the socialist accumulation was taking place at the expenses of the surplus values of the capitalistic economy, so also the private producers. And it was created by implementing an uneven exchange that, for instance, in agriculture, that would create a net agricultural surplus that would go into an intersectoral transfer to, for instance, finance industrialization and accumulation in the manufacturing sector. This has been obviously created distortions, if you want, or accumulation gap or taxation, if you want, between production and private consumption through the nationalization of strategic assets, and has been implemented very often and already Stiglitz, but now Bella Weber in the case of China makes a very great point about price scissors. So price scissors in the mainstream are basically perceived in mainstream economics as a signal of scarcity or market signals, whereas in a non-mainstream understanding, they are basically used as macroeconomic tools of redistribution. So, are not seen as a distortion, but interventions in prices are way of distributing surplus between sectors. There has been an emphasis, obviously, in creating a large socialist sector that would not focus on productivity, but on patterns of accumulation, at least in the short term. And this has been done by financial repression, so complete opposite direction with regards to the liberalization of the financial market, and also by taxing private consumption, so holding down private consumption. I'm using here the Uzbek case because, not because it's, because I like it, but also because it's very interesting. I often call it a small China in the sense that most of the, at least in the first 2 decades of the independence, they've been applied many of the tools that Chinese economies have applied in their economy. And also because it captures very well the transition, the gradualist transition and the U-turn into advanced form of contemporary state capitalism. And I will explain very briefly why. I hope I'm okay with time. So in the first decades of the independence, Uzbekistan financed its growth, so it's a state-led accumulation in two main ways. First, through an uneven exchange with agriculture, and second, through by creating this uneven exchange, so surplus in agriculture, by using the exchange. And this has been implemented through a series of complementary macroeconomic tools that were in complete contrast with the shock therapy strategy and neoliberal capitalism. So there has been, what I'm listing here is something that it goes, I mean, it reflects and mirrors the typical gradualist approach. So there is a gradual and selective privatization, and it's really similar to the Chinese model in which small and medium enterprise and service goes first, in the sense of they can go to the market, but holding on strategic sectors such as land, natural resources, and energy and infrastructure. Trade relations were based, and they're still based on political and geographical bilateralism rather than multilateralism. They have been implementing import substitution, industrialization, and having monopsony power at the state level to public system of procurements for strategic commodities, and I'll show two of them later on. And then there has been relatively high spending in health and education as percentage of GDP, as for the reasoning that Polanyi was saying, that market, like the state has to still adopt socialist policy to contrast with the shortfalls of market embeddedness. And there's been a slow process of price liberalization, especially in food commodities, so which are, from the Gadesky kind of stories, a very important and crucial commodity that creates inflationary pressure on wages, for instance. Plus, because of the currency restriction and very other macroeconomic tools, they've been having for at least 4 years ago a very healthy capital account surplus. So very briefly, I want to just give you a sense of how this was happening, how these interventions were happening in two commodities. One is the cotton sector, which, as I said, applied a monopsony, so only by the state at a taxed price, so at a very low price. And the buffer, so the surplus accumulation by selling in the international market was a very interesting source of this had happened still subsidized, and the whole process of production and distribution was centralized and managed at the state level. This process, in a way, it has avoided that the cotton supply would pass from a situation of stable prices, both for input and output, and an harmonized quality standard, to an extremely scattered and fragmented market-based structure, as we, for instance, saw in many sub-Saharan countries. And also, it has avoided to be exposed to international prices fluctuation. As a result, in 2014, Uzbek cotton was the fifth largest in the world in terms of export, and sixth in terms of production. Another very interesting commodity, which follows very pretty much the Chinese model, is the price control on wheat and grain. And this was done through a semi-quota system in which farmers were supposed to, I'm talking in the past because this system has been abolished in a couple of years ago, were supposed to sell their crop to the state. So there was a public procurement system at a fixed price. And this has two strategic objectives: to reduce the use of foreign currency for food import. And we have seen during the financial crisis, this has created massive disruptions in many countries, low-income countries. And also to ensure availability of food, of stable food in in remote rural area. As a result, the wheat production per capita has actually increased in the country, and food security standards and indicators have been improved. So as a result, just to have a snapshot of what is going on, the structural transfer, this surplus was created to be transferred in more high value sectors. There has been important investments in mineral sector, in the petrochemical sectors, in the pharmaceutical sector, in the automotive sectors, which has kind of triggered a structural transformations in the country. What is then the second part, and this is interesting because it connects to the current debate of state capitalism, is that the contingencies have changed. So my argument is that we need to, in order to understand the continuum of between, you know, state-led capitalism as it was in economic governance system, we need to understand that there are, first of all, there has been the awareness, and I mean, this has been highly studied and explored in critical geography, that capitalism to survive has to be intrinsically expansionary. And so this uneven exchange cannot be infinite. It has to stop at a certain point, and sources of surplus has to be found somewhere else, beyond the state borders. And there's been, as a result, there has been a process of transition towards private accumulation and through process of internationalization of capitalistic relations of production. And this has been the result of two determinants. One is internal, because there is a population growth, as per usual in middle-income countries, which demand higher wages, demands more jobs because of the young population. And also in urban areas, there is a creation of middle class that creates more that demands more liberal changes.
Sorry, Lorena.
But exactly, because of employment intrinsically, yeah.
Sorry, you're breaking up a lot in between. Is there any possibility you can disconnect any other device you're having?
Yeah.
From the Wi-Fi, so.
Yeah, sorry, where did
you
lost me?
No, it was just in between, but I thought since you're making now the main argument, it would be good to have it.
Yeah. So now the process, basically in contemporary debates of state capitalism, we are facing the problem that across low-income and middle-income countries, we have a young and increasing population pressure that demands employment and higher wages. And at the same time, in order for capital and infrastructure to sustain, you know, this expansionary and organic, you know, process of growth, we need more technology and capital to survive, meaning demand for technological innovation and integration to global value chains. This has been overlapping with external determinants that there is obviously, they haven't disappeared. So there is an increasing global governance pressures that attach to loans. So they also have been to finance this process of capital, manufacturing development. There's been a conditionality attached to it. And it's very interesting, this quote made that I extrapolated by a speech made by Lagarde, who visited Uzbekistan in 2009, that says, but will this investment be channeled to the most competitive and profitable firms? That has been a constant question in Uzbekistan. The answer is yes, if the price is right. So they've been obviously advocating for price liberalization, complete transparency in ownership, and endorsement to the corporate-led governance. Along this line, we are observing across, again, this is Uzbek case, but it's very similar to many other contexts in in the global south, to an opportunity that has been perceived and identified with the Belt and Road Initiative. And in Uzbekistan has been, I mean, I'm gonna pass to these slides maybe, has been like pretty striking. So they, over the past 10 years, have become the main trading partners, both for import and export. They increased by 53% in over $1 billion in the first 2 months of 2019, for instance. And they've been very interesting. This has been developed through a political and geopolitical and economic bilateralism. So it wasn't only, you know, mediated through private capital integration, but it was obviously hybrid forms of institutional cooperation. For instance, I mean, I'm starting to do some stakeholder interview on Zoom, and there has been interesting, you know, study tours done by Uzbek entrepreneurs in China and vice versa. So technological transfer is not only, you know, is not at all, at least from what I've been gathering as evidence, has not been transferred through market mechanism, but has been transferred through political agreements. A very interesting point also that the other side of the trade is that there is a massive investment in huge infrastructure and energy. And these are very interesting because they are very long term, but at the same time, they are super fast. So there has been a very, I mean, for those, I don't know if there are any participants who are Central Asian, is that there has been Central Asia is a kind of a agglomerate of 5 countries, and most of them are landlocked. There is a part that connects Uzbekistan and Tajikistan that is highly mountainous, and you could get, there were only 1 flight per week when I was working there in 2010. It was basically impossible logistically to, you know, like kind of smooth the trade relationship with them. And Uzbekistan has built a 20 kilometers tunnel in 32 months, which is like something that has changed the material conditions of and the reconfiguration of the production and trade relations between, you know, like in the region. So, so there is obviously, you know, a market and a capital accumulation that has been integrating private capital, but at the same time, this is highly influenced and connected to the public. So to conclude,
sorry, Lorena.
Yeah.
Okay, I just was about to say 2 more minutes.
Yeah, this is my last slide. So there is a blend and there is an hybrid relationship between process of public accumulation and market integration. And I mean, one of the contradictions or open questions that, you know, not only low-income countries, but high-income countries has is like this circular causation between credit. So they need to invest because we need to finance process of like employment creation to create a domestic demand. But what has been proved is that these processes can be implemented in by, you know, through private, like an international has been solidified, because there has been an exposure and volatility and also power relations that can influence very badly these processes. So also what has been proved is that in very rapid processes of privatization, what happened in many countries in the Soviet region is that there has been privatization overnight, and because there were no endogenous or local private capitalists ready to buy those you know, assets, the result has been, this has been encapsulated by the global economic powers and multinational corporation, which has basically jeopardized any chance of creating, you know, a more redistributional domestic process. So there is an obvious need to finance this process of development through FDI, but is like the open question, and we all those studies, BRI and Belt and Road Initiative, are basically trying to understand whether China offers a new model of creating, conditionality, because obviously there are like political and necessity attached to it. But first of all, they're very context specific and depends on the beneficiary as well. But they also attach to completely different paradigmatic relations in terms of institutional settings. So to make a long story short, there are like two examples in which, for instance, like the Western economic governance has demanded Uzbekistan but other countries to privatize, for instance, in terms of land, or in the clarification of property rights, which, I mean, China is not, for instance, interested in. And at the same time, what is the relationship? The second open question is, what is the relationship between the Chinese model and the Western financial model? So there is a way that we, dialectically kind of understand what are the differences, what are the different patterns, or is basically, going beyond neoliberalism, but the patterns of neoliberalism. How Chinese model can be integrating into hybrid forms of accumulation. So I basically ended with questions, but this is a very complicated issue, and I hope to, have a debate about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And before we go basically into a general discussion, as I mentioned before, we will have now a discussion between Lorena and Ikpe is going to give some comments concerning the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much. I think, first of all, Lorena, thank you very much for that. It was really, really fascinating. And, listening, trying to draw connections with some of the work that I've been engaged in, also looking at a quite a different space. But I think the theme itself of the state market dichotomy, that argument, is very central to my work. I think of when I started that work also, like you, about 10 years ago. So it was interesting when you drew that timeline for me as well. You made an initial point, of course, on the revival of the debate. And, it's true. I think not least this COVID-19 period, what we've seen, something that has struck me recently has been the debates around waiving the TRIPS agreement, waiving TRIPS waiver for vaccine production in parts of various so-called global South contexts, and the argument that's been put forward around that about how that might disincentivize investment from pharma, when there are recent reports that show actually that recent research that is suggesting that, for instance, in the UK, the Oxford vaccine was funded, I think, to the extent of about 97% by the state. So, how those narratives are utilized when they're needed. But as you mentioned also, Mariana Mazzucato has been making this argument for a long time, that it's almost a myth. This point that is made, and also the idea that this is merely in global South context. I mean, everywhere we look, this is what we're facing and what we're dealing with. So, the point on market transitions, I learned a great deal sort of reflecting and thinking about that, and I agree entirely with your point about the hegemonic understanding, that really centered around the state market dichotomy. And you refer to this a lot when you speak about the Washington consensus, post-Washington consensus. But I dare say also in those of us who are heterodox scholars are also ourselves, quite often play to this dichotomy as well. So Ben Fine, a lot of my work has been on developmental statehood, and Ben Fine has been, I guess, very vocal around how that space, for instance, shows very clearly how heterodox scholars themselves fall into this trap. But the difference is that it is more dynamic, right? The way that they position, the way this distinction occurs. So he speaks about, for instance, you see this clearly when you think of an economic school and a political school, and you see very clearly how those spaces are divided, where one is seen as dealing with the economic issue, and the other is seen as dealing with a political issue that's very linked to the construct of this of the state. And I think also there's Tandika and Kandaruwe makes a similar argument, but thinking about the sort of ideology structure nexus, also thinking about developmental statehood in African context. I also found very intriguing the point about primitive socialist accumulation, the point you made about a surplus extraction, again, something very familiar to me. I worked a lot on Nigeria, but in many parts of the continent, especially the post-independence period, we had what were called marketing boards for a whole range of commodities, something inherited from the colonial period. This is really, you also mentioned how surplus extraction occurred from the periphery to the UK, for instance, and this was a huge vehicle for that. But that was also used by states in the post-independence period, because it was a sort of straightforward institutional mechanism to continue that surplus extraction, but to a new purpose. And a big element of that purpose was, of course, structural transformation. And it was hugely necessary. So this extraction from agriculture into the industrial sector was very central to this part of the world. So I found that also a very relevant contribution to some of what is very familiar to me. So I think thinking a bit about that, a question that comes to my mind, so I'll intersperse this with questions if that's all right. You said something about, when you spoke about patient capital, you also, when reflecting on the Uzbek case study, highlighted how banking and telecoms were sort of, it seems, if that's my understanding, were those that were initially selected for, well, the privatization was, so it was a space where that was possible. And I'm quite intrigued by that, because when I look at other contexts, especially spaces I work in, banking is a space that's very protected. So the idea that that would be, there'd be more, I guess, it's prioritized for privatization. I found that very intriguing. I wonder if you could, oh, did I get that wrong? Was that?
Yeah, actually, no, banking is one of the last things that has been,
I see.
that all the insurance and the privatization of services that has been privatized, like deregulated, let's say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But actually banking, sorry, if I close to, when we look at the state as a, as an economic actor, we can link not only the role of the marketing board to the process of industrialization, but for instance, how in Uzbekistan and in many other countries where still have, the state acting as a financial actor, you have a banking that are sectorial. So you have specific banking dealing with agricultural development, you have preferential loans to specific crops. So there is a kind of a shaping, like sectorial development.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting, but yeah, just to briefly.
No, that's very useful. Thank you, because I was very intrigued by that. That sounds very unusual, but it's good to have gotten it better now. Thank you. So let me see my next point. So you made a point about intersectoral surplus movements, of course, and I'm intrigued by the links between that and import substitution industrialization. For instance, of course, this tends to be where it stands, and the underlying. So we spoke a lot about sort of the economic arguments for it, which are clear, but I'm interested also in what underlying social and political dynamics, if that's a space you've looked at, has informed that. And the reason for that is the approach I have taken to trying to challenge this sort of state market dichotomous approach within the heterodox sphere is, how do we think of underlying dynamics, so economic, social, political, that are reproduced both within the state and market spaces, right? So I'll give an example, and I think of Ethiopia, and a lot of attention to Chinese capital. Now, on paper, the latter point you made is that they need those resources. Ethiopia doesn't have a lot of mineral resources like other African economies. So Chinese finance makes sense as a stopgap to address the sort of savings investment gap. But what has underpinned that as well is traditionally if you think of the the government led by Meles Zenawi, the former prime minister, who was sort of the architect of Ethiopia as a developmental state, it was linked to a reticence to deal with private capital because of a sort of struggle for power contestation. So it came across as easier to manage foreign capital than domestic private capital. So I'm interested if you can on some of those underlying dynamics that have informed this sort of direction. I think this speaks to a next point I had, which was this drawing this internationalization in terms of trying to source finance, and this turn towards the BRI, turn towards China. That was my point. And then I also wanted to find out, so you spoke a bit about the this what has gone on in terms of what Chinese resources has financed in Uzbekistan, but I'm interested in, are there any links between that and the sort of priority sectors you mentioned earlier, right? So how is that connecting to, for instance, import substituting industrialization? You mentioned a lot of what is going on, but in terms of, I think you'd mentioned cotton, wheat as priority areas. Are there any links between that and sort of the engagement with China at the moment?
Okay, thank you very much. This is like great questions and observations. And I think it's an opportunity for me to clarify some of the points, because for the sake of time, maybe I haven't gone through the evolution as it is at the moment, because I grasped a lot of what was the first stage of capital accumulation, the primitive socialist state-led accumulation. But I mean, I don't know if I can say, unfortunately, and I can see that Montu from Cambridge is here, there are like different settings at the moment, which are much more market-oriented and has changed completely the reconfiguration. But I think it's important to grasp these tensions, as you said, for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, where there is like, these tensions between how to allocate, like how to trust domestic capital versus foreign investments. So, but let me start with the question on social policy, because I think it's really, really important. And I mean, I'm not trying to defend the category. Too often economists forget like all the rest, and I myself tend to be a structuralist too much. But because we imply that, I mean, because we really focus on the structural issues, we forget to unpack that these also entail social implications. And I have my second head of research is on feminist economics and gender. And it really, I recently published a paper on how women's work in post-socialist Uzbekistan and contemporary Uzbekistan has changed and shaped social reproduction. So the thing is that there is an integration between what populations and women produces and what have been the implication for the well-being or welfare, if you want. And the socialist case is very interesting. The socialist case, the Soviet case is very interesting because there has been cases in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America of very strong social policies, but they were really at the forefront. And if you think about it, the idea of examples are of social policies implemented through state-owned enterprises are very famous. So if you think about the pension schemes that all these, centralized and big size production has been implemented, or the system of childcare, or even the quota system for women that wanted to, be promoting integration in STEM or sector where usually women are not, present. So to avoid this, what can we call like gender segregation, gender labor segregation. So there has been, space to complement structural economic policies to social policies. And I agree with you that it's been not explored much. And this is actually one of the direction in which I would like to go and explore. But again, it's really important to explore it in an historical perspective, because sometimes we really think, and I'm not saying that the debate on state capitalism at the moment is doing it, but I mean, sometimes they are a little bit historically blind in the sense that we haven't looked at episodes and cases that have been present in the past, and obviously cannot be just applied as copy and paste to the present, but we can learn lessons from what happened. So, and social policy in transition economy has been very overlooked. The other interesting point that you made is about these tensions between domestic and private capital. And I mean, I'm not like an expert on the clan system of countries in Central Asia, but there is obviously a hierarchical structures that is not, cannot be transferred to an ontological Western, conception of, for instance, class, but there is obviously, issue of, kinship, historical, ethnic minority. There's been it's a very complex society. So there is obviously power and wealth clusters, which have been often overlapped to political economic clusters. At the same time, Uzbekistan and Central Asia is being colonized. I mean, we can look at Soviet Union as a colonizer with a completely different, in a completely different fashion as the, extractivist and predatory colonialism that happened, in India, in Congo, or in, in much more violent ways. But there's been, a colonial relationship in that sense. And this has been a little bit of a missing actor in my presentation, but the role of Russia has played a huge role in the way investments and foreign investments have taken place for instance, in the energy sector. The interesting part is that because there is a further opening up and integration to the global, economic system, and because we are observing a mushrooming powers, paradoxically, China has offered an alternative and a leverage and this is my understanding, in the, decision and in power relations with Russia, for instance, or with other powers. For instance, Turkey has also very important presence in the region. So everything is very dynamic and complex. So I'm not sure if I answer your question about this external dichotomy, but for sure it's now kind of competing and can have very interesting political economic implications. With regards to cotton and wheat, this has been liberalized, both of them, in different ways, and but I think has been very recent. So one issue as linked to in the case of cotton is being linked to the price of international commodities, and also is linked to the policy of upgrading. So they're trying to develop further the textile industry. So for sure, they want to develop internal backward and forward linkages. And this obviously has a role for Chinese because they are both a source, a market, but also like they have a strong relationship in terms of machineries. And also, in terms of wheat is a very interesting, and grain in general is a very sensitive and politically sensitive commodity. As we know, because it's true that it's like it's been that policy. I've written a paper, but I think I'm the only one who thinks that there has been also benefits in this very grain sovereignty policy, because, for instance, one of the criticism is that domestic wheat is perceived as low quality, so it doesn't produce good quality bread. And because of the improvement of living conditions, urban middle class are demanding bread from grain and wheat from international market. So in the long term, there is space to question the feasibility and the sustainability of the policy. So it's linked societal structures. But yeah, there is still an attention for what happens to there is no price control on bread, but there is, for instance, now more consumption-based policies. So I know that during the COVID crisis, they have implemented food voucher. Sensitive topic in a context of dynamic development. So, but yeah, no, thank you for your questions. They were like really on point on this.
No, thank you very much for that. It's really, really fascinating, and I learned a great deal, I think, for sure. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ikpe, for giving comments and great questions, and I really enjoyed the discussion now. So now I think we can open up questions to the floor. So if there are any questions, you can post them or raise the hand, exactly. So we already have Saxena?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Lorena. Listening with interest as always, and as you know, these papers are reading from my students, so we've been discussing them a lot. But I think just from the same, one of the things I wanted to, clarify was from the questions asked already, and you've answered them very well, but just add a little bit to that. One of the things that's quite important is that I would not define Soviet Union as the colonizer in the maritime empire sense at all. And I think important part for there is that the relationship that existed before, so it's the Russian Empire, which is the colonizer. Soviet Union continued maybe some of those things, but if Soviet Union was a colonizer in the same sense, we would not be having the discussion today of the industrial sectors which were developed locally and how much value add happened locally. And we have so many different sectors. That's kind of how I measure it. But what I would say, the other two aspects, one of them being how the Soviet economic system, which distributed in a different way, meaning creating particular kinds of inputs, and I say this very often, that the Uzbekistan or Central Asian country or any one of the 15 republics were left with making a fantastic wing for a plane that was not going to be produced anymore, because everybody did their bit to get to the central part to make that particular thing. And Soviet Union, left that. So that moment is very important, that how sectors develop themselves, and the dynamics of it. These things are all kind of what make them distinct from the Chinese side. So behavior as measured from outside may look very similar to Chinese, but the pathways through which this is being approached or achieved are quite distinct. So, for instance, if you take the wages aspect, the discussion relatively recently, you were there actually, 2019 Sadiq Safayev in Cambridge. talking to him about this, and very interesting, different argument than we would come through. So you want to find ways to increase the wages. So, but not only increase the wages, but increase the wages in a formal sense, meaning they're taxable wages. Because a lot of the wages are in informal economy up till now, because of various other things that we've discussed. So the sense of a state maturing is important. So that's when we talk about shock in the system. We need to think differently. The shock was becoming independent. It's very different from China again. Like nobody was expecting to be independent. Yeah, there 30 years ago, all of a sudden, you're a country. You need everything. You don't even have a currency. Forget everything else, right? So you're starting from that. So development of state has a different pace than the development needs. And I think those structural changes can lead us to very different analysis using the models that we use, either the socialist or the capitalist ones. So they're meaning that they're very pragmatic. So the trade to centralization life is not predicated in an ideological framework historically, right? They don't come to that, and in many ways, when we say primitive, they're trying to return off into that primitive. Trade is trade, so we will pick up whatever model, which piece of the model works for us now at this moment. And so when we think that either are we going through the binaries of neoliberal or kinds of neoliberal versus the state-led enterprise, because state itself is thinking through what it is. And that's why we see the current, as you see the market mania that's ensuing at the moment, and how much of that is informed by Kazakhstan. So one of the assertions I would make, and I'll stop talking, is that the arguments, a lot of the arguments Uzbeks are using to justify what they're doing now is that they say Kazakhs have tried it, and that worked, so we will do that and see how far that takes us. Chinese is an important story here. The broader picture here is that China's two major corridors, one through Kazakhstan and Eurasia and other through Pakistan, in the middle, they want this bit to be stable. And they are making fun, so to justify certain things, it's not an immediate economic relationship. It's a relationship which is the bigger picture of the geo-economic and geostrategic picture. If this region is prosperous, those corridors will work. Otherwise, they won't. And that's that's a pixel of the picture, but that's a very important consideration. So I'll stop there.
Do you want me to reply to that or no? No, because I mean, they're interesting.
No, of course you should comment.
It's like, I don't know if Ariane wants to collect another question. Okay.
I think I haven't seen any other questions in the chat, so feel free to reply.
Thank you, Monto. I mean, Monto is an anthropologist and a central analyst in Cambridge, and it's like, it's obviously always very interesting to discuss things with him. But thanks for coming, by the way. No, I mean, you're right. I mean, my warning was that, I mean, I would use the word colonialism, but yeah, I mean, Tashkent was a university hub in the 70s. We haven't seen in any other cases in colonial history to have a colonizer to, like transfer technology, knowledge, infrastructure in the way that, like the Soviet Union has done so I completely agree on that. I mean, there is a conquer, like in the sense of, the conquest part of it. Another very interesting point, it's true, I agree, there is no, I mean, obviously there are similarities in terms of policies, but I mean, Uzbekistan, although is like, also predates the Soviet Union, is an independent country for like 25 years. There is no way of comparing, as you said, the sovereignty and culture of sovereignty that China has, after 1,000 years. But yeah, there is I think you raise a really important point. So, and that is why the reasons of why I'm using the debate on market transition to problematize and kind of make it a little bit more heterogeneous, these blocks, like of state capitalism, because as you said, there is a state, like there is within the structure of the economy and the geographical boundaries of what is an economic system, we need to, you know, like there are very contingental and like space and like specific needs that each specific context need. But yeah, I mean, what I found it interesting is that I completely recognize, and I agree with you, that there is now a market mania that has been, you know, they've been like orientalizing markets, which is very interesting. And from a Western point of view, it's like, you know, you're going.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to hear your point of view on that because I mean, I'm so skeptical that they have any actually interest in the markets whatsoever. They simply want to be in the metrics. They have charts after charts, so they can show that they are up there in the world. Whether they actually do anything or not is another story.
Yeah, no, but I mean, this is exactly, you know, the performative, you know, angle to it. It's very interesting in the sense that this is clearly, you know, a response to a clear pressure coming from international financial institutions. They've been bombarded for years to like make price rights, deregulate, privatize. So, I mean, if they want to enter in the club, at least by, you know, like they have to at least show and pretend to be in. The question is whether they are gonna promise and like kind of negotiate that process or conform to the like hegemonic premises. And this will be, in my humble opinion, very, very problematic in the long term, because I mean, they're not ready structurally. I go back to my structural economics identity. But yeah, I mean, and this is happening. I mean, I think it's a very interesting debate, and I recommend really to read this argument of this like very like new literature on state capitalism, because you know there has been now OECD and IMF. They cannot deny that there are benefits in having some sort of public institutions, but there is no way that they're gonna endorse the settings that implies. So they still have to be embedded into market structure and to profit-led. So there is a clear tension. And these are like the time where, you know, in a context of crisis where, you know, COVID has created massive unemployment everywhere. I mean, we will need the state in some forms and actions. So let's see. I mean, IMF and World Bank are famous, and I mean, I know this, but for like, you know, saying, oh, we understand, but eventually the policy and practice is completely contradictory. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Yes, we have a little bit more time for more questions. If there are any other questions from the floor, like I said, you can raise the hand or put the question in the chat. I'm just gonna wait a bit. All right, so Ikpe, please go ahead.
Thank you. I figured if no questions are coming, can I jump in? So, Lorena, I mean, I know you flagged this, but I wonder, you know, in the interest of sort of concept building around this, and you know, you've said it already, this conversation about state capitalism, I think I read the paper talking about that. This is we're in a new phase, we're in a new space. From what you're seeing, what are there patterns that are saying there's something peculiar, something different about this engagement with this form of engagement that you're mapping with China, something that could be useful for looking at other spaces and other contexts? I know you say you want to go back to using this lens of primitive socialist accumulation. Is that what you see that this is adding that isn't there? What value is it adding in terms of how we can use this as a tool for wider analysis, I guess?
Yeah, I actually want to, I mean, thanks for the question. I think it's, I mean, the premise of social colonization, I use it to historicize the issue of state capitalism, contemporary state capitalism. I don't think we can apply primitive social accumulation at the moment, unfortunately, because there is no way of creating, first of all, this like closed, it requires like a kind of a closed economy and intersectoral specificity. What I think it can be useful as an analytical lens, and I mean, it has to be obviously empirically applied, is to look at, and I think that it can be applied as a transversal kind of analytical lens, is to look at, once we create sources of public accumulation, to look at what is the distributional, and first of all, how these are maintained. Because, you know, the whole story is that this is not efficient and not sustainable in the long term, but it's been demonstrated that in other cases it has worked. And I mean, there's been, you know, like long-term planning and public production in some countries. So first of all, are they maintained? And what are they, and this is relates to your question about social policy, what are the distributional implications? So how these, you know, like this surplus is gonna be redistributed beyond production. And I mean, in my work, I've done that at the kind of micro meso level. I never, you know, first of all, because of lack of data, the problem with people who study developing economics or low-income countries is that it's really hard to, you know, to draw patterns when you have macroeconomic data that are really scattered and, you know, like not is aggregated enough or not long-term or so. Yeah, that's the challenge, to basically keep tracking and tracing these processes of structural transformation, if you want, by looking at the source and distribution of surplus, but also looking at what has been the redistributional mechanism. So, I mean, in that sense, integrating state policies, looking at both production and industrial policy, but also social policies. These, I think, can be like something that state capitalism debate should, you know, work on. I don't know if I answered your questions. I tried. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. It's a very, yeah, it's a good point. We need to think through that more.
Okay, then I can see no other question. And thank you so much, Lorena, for giving a very interesting talk. And thank you so much, Ikpe, for the great comments and questions. I really enjoyed it, and AH is very thankful for your contributions in that. For the wider audience, we're going to have our next webinar in June, and then we have our January conference in July. So I hope I see some of you then there. And yes, thank you very much and have a great weekend then.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lorena, and to the organizers, Ariane.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.
Take care.